Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Peak Human. It's been a second. Welcome to the new year. Took a little break and had a lot going on with the Food Lies film. That's my main project right now. Finally finishing that film. It's been many years, I know, but it's all worth it. It's just me and my guy Jay, the director, editor. We don't have a big team. We don't have any money. We're doing this on our own, and it takes a long time. It's going to be a 6-part series. It's going to be amazing. Watch the intro on the Food Lies YouTube. It's so good. We were working so hard on this. I'm telling you, I was up till 10:30 on Sunday night working on this. We're doing weekends now. We're trying to get it done. I also have Nose to Tail. My company's Nose to Tail. That's how we are doing this. That's how we're still alive. That's how I can barely pay the rent. We use single family ranchers in Texas, just one family for each animal. They do the best practices. It's amazing. Go to nosetotale.org. You got to order a box there. We ship to all 48 states. It's like Butcher Box, but better. We have the regenerative meat. It's all from the US. It's from Texas. It's not from overseas. And it's using the best practices. Our pork and chicken, low PUFA diets. We give them no corn, no soy, organic feed, on land, on pasture, moving around, rotational grazing. We do it all. We also have body care products. Super popular stuff, the skin food. The skin food is made from beef tallow and just a few other ingredients. Super clean. It's what your body wants. Soaks up into your skin. All natural. You don't want that other funny stuff. You don't want weird chemicals on your body. You want animal fat. And of course, we have the biltong, dried meats, all the good stuff on the go. We have livervores too, one of our dried meats with liver in it. I've just been eating that so I can get my liver in. It's the best way to sneak liver into your diet, get those extra nutrients. So go to nosetotale.org, support us. Really, all I got going is the Food Lies film, Nose to Tail, and the Sapien Center. Not making money on any of these, just staying afloat. So please support these small businesses. It's just me and a couple people who work hard, who really believe in the mission. And we just want to give good products to you. And we have super high quality products that aren't cheap to make. And we don't make a lot of profit on them, but we do it because we love it. And so nosetotale.org, Food Lies Film, Sapien Center if you're in Austin. But now onto the show with Elliot Overton. After developing some minor health issues of his own after an extended backpacking trip through Asia, Elliot decided to take responsibility and began researching ways by which he could find resolution without the use of pharmaceutical medications. Elliot soon discovered that the solution to his problems was rooted in nutrition and basic lifestyle principles. Elliot's experience and the experience of those close to him demonstrated the power of nutritional intervention. Elliot's success in improving his own health journey inspired him to study nutrition at a professional standard so that he could go on to help others along the way. Elliot trained as a nutritional therapist at the College of Naturopathic Medicine in the UK and later gained a qualification in functional medicine. He's a really smart guy, great YouTube channel, goes deep on thiamine, which is B1, and oxalates. A lot of people are really into these anti-nutrients these days, discovering why plant foods might not be ideal in high amounts for all people. Maybe we shouldn't be eating them 24/7 like I did. I had a problem eating spinach and kale shakes with almond milk for days and days on end for years. Didn't serve me well. So now people are waking up to this, avoiding certain foods with high oxalates. And also, we talk a lot about thiamine. Super important vitamin. A lot of people are deficient in it. A lot of things in modern life deplete it. Caffeine, alcohol, stress, exercise even. A lot of good things and bad things in our modern world, toxins in the environment, deplete thiamine. And so you may want to get it checked or even supplement it. Even though I'm not into supplementing, this could be the time to do it. So really cool episode. We go deep into these subjects and a lot more. Elliot's right in line with so many things. Super smart guy. He's on the team. He lives a sapien diet and lifestyle. And before we start, I want to talk about Element. Element is the first sponsor of the show that's not my own company. It is a great product that I use. I just used it. I played beach volleyball 4 hours on Saturday and 2.5 hours today. I needed some electrolytes. So I mix up a huge bottle with 2 packets of Element, 64 ounces of water, and I drink it all day, and it saves my life. It saves my life. You need to put back in electrolytes if you're out there working out. A lot of people need some electrolytes if they're just, not getting them all from diet. I think it's really important, especially people who are doing really animal-based diets. Maybe they're not getting enough magnesium and potassium in their diet. So it's a great solution. I like how they say, hey, you can make your own version. You can buy bulk supplements online and put together some sodium, magnesium, potassium, or you get Element and it has some flavor in it and it's in a packet and it's super easy. So I think it's a good product. I use it. So I decided to partner up with them and tell people about them on my show. I can't talk about nose to tail all day, every day. People get it. Yes, nosetotale.org. I heard it a million times, but now we have Element. You can go to drinkelement.com/peakhuman and get a special offer. So it's drinklmnt.com/peakhuman. Get a special offer. They have some free stuff. You get a free sample pack if you go through that link. So support them, support Nose to Tail, get your box of meat, get your skin food, get that amazing beef tallow skin cream, and enjoy this show with Elliot Overton. All right, we're live. We're live with Elliot Overton. How's it going? Where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from France, actually. I was living in the UK, but we decided to make the move about 18 months ago.
Oh, wow. How's it going over there so far?
It's okay. It's had a bumpy couple of years, but it's the south of France. The summer, the weather kind of makes up for that. So yeah, it's better than the UK anyway.
Yeah, well, I traveled around. I've been to Biarritz, actually. Is that how you say it?
I'm not sure. Is that a place in France?
Yeah, it's like a surfing town that's on the south coast on the other side.
Excellent.
Not the Mediterranean, yeah.
Right, yeah. I'm towards Toulouse, which is kind of like not far from Spain, actually. But unfortunately, we're not close to any beaches. It takes about 3 hours to drive in any direction to get there.
Well, I think you're getting some more sun down there, at least from England. But
Yeah.
maybe we'll get into a little vitamin D at some point. But I think we're going to focus on thiamine and oxalates, which is awesome stuff. My crowd's really into that. It's a hot topic in the animal-based community, which we'll get into and why. But you were just saying you get really deep into these two topics and you don't want to be a jack of all trades, which is funny because I kind of do the opposite. I am the jack of all trades and I don't go deep on any topic, but I love to pick all these people's brains that have done the great research and all the work with clients and all that stuff. So that is my role. You guys, you be the experts. So why thiamine? Why'd you get so into it?
Yeah, it's a funny question. Actually, not many people, especially in the alternative health field, know that much about this vitamin. It turns out that, like if you study nutrition, you look at alternative nutrition, alternative medicine, you'll see a vast swathe of information on niacin for cardiovascular diseases, activated vitamin B12 and methylfolate for methylation problems. But you don't often hear much about B1. It turns out that, I am fairly convinced at this point that B1 or thiamine is perhaps one of the most misunderstood vitamins, but also is fairly unique with response to with regard to the other B vitamins in its ability to protect the body from stress. And I think that it has many roles aside from its established biochemical roles, which aren't well understood, but appear to be highly protective for all living organisms when they're under conditions of chronic stress. And I think that this is really important, particularly in a modern day world, where not only are we exposed to, not only have we nutritionally kind of depleted diets and processed foods, but we're also exposed to a wide variety of other toxic chemicals and electromagnetic frequencies and lots of basically unnatural things which place the body under a certain level of physiological stress. And that's not necessarily referring to the stress response, the hormonal stress response, but really the cellular stress response. So cells being unable to effectively cope with the demands placed on them from a more kind of bioenergetic standpoint.
Yeah, actually, I got interested in thiamine because it seems like everything in the modern world depletes thiamine. It's like coffee, alcohol, stress. Yeah, just all the stuff around us. Is there a more exhaustive list?
Yeah, there's really, if you look at all of the things which are going to tank thiamine, it's ironic because a lot of the things that we tend to do in our modern day society have a negative impact on that. Really, the primary thing which is going to have the most depleting effect on B1 is refined carbohydrate intake, or really refined intake of refined foods. But there does seem to be a direct correlation between the intake of refined carbohydrate and the thiamine status of an organism. So this was basically established in some animal research done a very long time ago, where they showed that if you made animals, I think it was pigeons at the time, you made them deficient in B1, then putting them on a low carbohydrate diet managed to mitigate many of those effects. Whereas if they ate a diet which contained more carbohydrates, then they developed the deficiency symptoms very early on. And so if you look at what thiamine actually does, for the listeners who aren't aware, it is one of the B vitamins. And like all of the B vitamins, it's needed for how we're breaking down food and converting that into usable energy. Aside from that, it does lots of other really cool stuff. It's very important for the nervous system, the brain, the heart. It's involved in how well we're breaking down proteins and how we can utilize those. But in terms of energy, the pathway by which we use to metabolize carbohydrates, there's a step, an enzyme, which is called pyruvate dehydrogenase. This comes out of the back of glycolysis and enters into the Krebs cycle, if the listeners want to know the details. But basically, this enzyme is dependent on B1. And so the concept is that if you are consuming a higher amount of carbohydrate, then that is naturally going to increase the requirement for B1 in the cell. It's also important for how we're breaking down protein for energy and fat for energy as well. So it's not the case that if you don't eat carbohydrate, you don't need B1, but it seems to be the case that a lower carbohydrate or, say, animal-based approach or a ketogenic diet might be sparing of thiamine. But it's interesting. I mean, you say that there's lots of things that tank B1. The way that they originally discovered B1 was it was in Japan. It was in the early 20th century, if I remember correctly. And what they found was that there was a well-known disease at the time. They didn't know what to call it. They referred to it as beriberi, but really what this was a collection of symptoms that people developed when they began eating refined white rice. So you had the higher classes who were consuming lots of the rice which had been milled and polished. You take out the brown part of it, and this was kind of like a status symbol at the time. They discovered that those people were eventually getting very sick, and they couldn't really understand it. What they discovered was that the people who ate the brown rice were not getting this sickness. And so they kind of ascertained that, okay, there's something in that brown portion of the rice that's protective against this disease. Eventually, they went on to isolate it, and they found out that it was thiamine, and did lots of research on that. But so it turns out that when you refine foods, when you remove a lot of the B vitamins from that, then it tends to increase the requirement. Well, let's just say you're not getting as much coming in, and so that is one of the things that can deplete body stores pretty quickly.
Yeah. So what foods have a lot of thiamine in it? Well, maybe we'll start there, and then we'll keep going into more of these details.
Yeah, so thiamine is pretty ubiquitous. It's not too difficult to get from most foods. Most foods contain, like the other B vitamins as well, it's not limited to certain types of foods. You find a lot, for instance, in random plants like asparagus. That's pretty high. You find quite a lot in brown rice or in certain grains and legumes. But you also get a high amount in any kind of animal food because animals, like humans, like plants, like fungi, they all require thiamine to exist. So the cells that you're cooking and eating are essentially, they're going to contain thiamine. Liver is particularly high in thiamine. But yeah, it's not really that difficult to get enough from the diet. If we're looking, or if we're approaching it from a kind of, let's say, an ancestral or evolutionary standpoint, it would be fairly easy not to become deficient in this, right? Especially eating kind of sufficient animal foods, you're going to be getting enough. So the amount that you will need per day is roughly, it's estimated to be between 1 and 1 milligram. And that's really not too difficult to get, as long as you're eating kind of like if you eat some organ meats, it can be very easy to obtain.
Yeah.
The issue comes when you look at all of the things that can deplete B1. And what I'm less interested is in things like coffee. And coffee is something which can deplete B1 to some extent, to a mild extent. Certain drugs can do that as well, refining the food. But if someone is not eating a refined food diet, if they're eating a whole food diet, whether that be, carnivore or animal based or rapeat or whatever, they're likely getting enough through their diet. So their nutritional program contains enough. However, there's many people who still seem to need a lot more. That's what I'm very interested in, is not the environmental factors per se, which increase the requirement or can have somewhat of a depleting effect, but really the conditions internally which can have a depleting effect. And this is why I think that thiamine is fairly unique among the B vitamins, is because if you look at a wide variety of different diseases or disease states, the effects that occur at the cellular level increase the demand for B1, and it seems to be B1 specifically. There's certain conditions like inflammation that can kind of deplete B6. It can enhance the requirement for methylation, etc. But really, if you look at what happens when a cell is stressed, and this applies again across the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, it would seem as though thiamine is kind of a universal. It's been referred to as a universal response to cellular stress. And what this means is, give you an example, if a cell is exposed to certain toxins, this could be heavy metals, this could be endogenous neurotoxins, this can be any other kind of like toxic chemical, then one of the things that this does is it enhances the cells, enhances certain enzymes being the little machines that kind of make things, convert one thing into another. And one of the responses to these kinds of toxins is to enhance the thiamine dependent enzymes. So all of the enzymes involved in energy metabolism which require B1, there's one in particular which is called alpha ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. And it turns out that this one enzyme is responsible for regulating metabolism at every other step. So it's been referred to as a gateway to energy metabolism. In other words, if you don't have enough B1, or if this enzyme becomes inhibited, then it means that the cells lose the ability to generate energy. And without generating enough energy, they become dysfunctional. And it's kind of coming back to this bioenergetic view of cellular health or tissue organ systemic health, is if there's enough, or if there's sufficient usable energy by the cell, then generally things are going to work quite well. And it seems as though there's this intimate relationship between thiamine status, or how much thiamine a cell has, and how well it can make energy. And so there's lots of things that can kind of mimic a deficiency of B1 at the cellular level, which are not caused by a nutritional deficiency in the diet. So someone can be eating enough, but they still don't have enough thiamine. And that can be because of a toxin issue. That can be because of an inflammation issue. That can be because of some kind of disease state, which is enhancing that requirement. And this has been found in Alzheimer's disease. This has been found in Parkinson's disease, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome. There's lots of different conditions which seem to have this cellular deficiency of B1, but which cannot be addressed merely by eating more in the diet.
Yes. And this is, I had a guy who actually is part of he started the thiamine advocacy group because he's so into it. And he had all these problems, didn't know what was going on. He went completely carnivore, still didn't solve the problems. Then he did the super physiological doses of thiamine, the good version that you like to use. And his whole life changed. Yeah. Amazing results. Yeah. And I also think of this thiamine stuff, like I used this example once before because I remember in biochem back in college, there was a rate determining step, and you needed a certain amount of the molecule to have the reaction. It's like, oh, you need fire, you need oxygen for a fire. As soon as you run out of oxygen, the fire goes out. So that's kind of what's going on with thiamine. We have certain things, and energy production is of course the most important thing to our body to make ATP. And if we don't have enough thiamine, then that is a problem. And that's why you mentioned fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, some of those things. It's basically just a lack of energy production. And then the brain stuff too, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, super interesting.
Yeah, you say the rate limiting step. That's exactly what we're talking about, in that the thiamine dependent enzymes, in particular that one, alpha ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, is the rate limiting step for how we're converting food into energy using oxygen. You can do it backup route. You can do it via anaerobic glycolysis, but you're going to be generating lots of lactic acid. It's a very inefficient way to make energy. And the ironic thing is that if you look at the cellular effects of a lack of thiamine, it is the equivalent to hypoxia. So if you expose a cell to hypoxia, being an oxygen deficiency, all of our cells need oxygen. But if you expose them to hypoxia, one of the first things that it will do is drastically increase the amount of thiamine transporters on the membrane and suck up all of the thiamine that it can possibly get. And it's interesting here because we see kind of this concept that the cells, again, across all kingdoms, they use thiamine to protect against stress. And if someone's someone's cells are under stress, then this is one of those things that can enhance the requirement. And it's interesting. There's been a variety of studies. There's a researcher named Victoria Bunick. She's based in Russia, and she's done a lot of research on these kind of topics. And she was really one of the leaders or thought leaders in this regard on this topic. But what her and a team have done experiments where, for instance, if you expose animals to head trauma, so you would, I guess, in the experiments, they would bash their heads, and they measure the different activities of the enzymes and the energy production and neuroinflammation. Anyway, so what they did was they gave animals really, 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 really high doses of B1 before getting the head trauma, and what they showed was that it didn't fully mitigate the damage, but it mitigated a lot of the biochemical perturbations that you would see with head trauma. So, for instance, it maintained ATP production, it reduced neuroinflammation. A lot of the neurochemicals, there's a neurotransmitter called glutamate, which is highly excitotoxic when it's in too high amounts, meaning that it can cause cells to rapidly fire, neurons to rapidly fire. And what they showed was that by giving super high doses of these of thiamine to these animals beforehand, it protected against lots of those effects. They've done several different studies. Many other teams have also looked into this. For instance, if you expose mitochondria to certain toxins and then you give the mitochondria thiamine beforehand, they showed that actually it protects mitochondria from damage. It reduces neuroinflammation. It reduces a lot of those abnormalities. So it does seem as though the evidence points towards this overall kind of universal function of thiamine as or as a protectant. It's in the plant research, it's even been referred to as an alarmone, a stress alarmone, which is basically when the plant is kind of in a condition where it's going to be difficult to survive, and it's like hostile environment. Then thiamine acts as one of the main tools through which it can adapt to that environment, and then it can kind of protect and maintain kind of healthy function in that case. So the researchers, there've been a couple of groups who've actually tested this. Most well-known is Antonio Costantini in Italy, and he passed away a couple of years ago, actually. But he was a neurologist who was very interested in thiamine and using it in this respect. He cited research, or in some of his papers, he looks at research, for instance, in Parkinson's disease. There have been very interesting findings which would indicate that cells in particular regions in the brain become deficient. And this is not a nutritional deficiency per se. It's like they have enough thiamine elsewhere, but there's only specific regions of the brain which become deficient in B1. So we wanted to test this hypothesis. What he discovered, and there's various case studies online, you can see the video evidence, and there's thousands of people who are doing this on the groups. I've had several clients who have also done this successfully. What they discovered was that by giving very high doses of B1, they could, in some cases, completely abolish the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And they found that these people, sometimes they'd had the disease for years. They found that, I mean, on my YouTube channel, I actually recently interviewed a lady called Daphne Bryan who wrote a book on it. She is now in almost symptomatic remission, and she has been for several years, just using B1 every single day. Parkinson's, for those who don't know, is considered a neurodegenerative condition, and there's no cure for it. Even the conventional medications, they don't halt the progression. And so this is quite amazing. He discovered this in tens of people. He later did research on a variety of other neurological conditions. There was one case study for fibromyalgia where they used 3 patients. They found that by giving, it was between 1,500 milligrams, which is 1,500 times what you would get from food, by the way. So 1,500 milligrams to 2,000 milligrams. They found that when the two of the patients reached, they reached 1,800, they developed overnight practically an 80% reduction in symptoms. And this is in pain and fatigue. So there have also been thousands of people who saw this research and they've been doing this since then. Facebook groups seem to be a place that a lot of people kind of congregate. But again, you see really miraculous effects. And the theory is that if you look at some of the research into these conditions, it shows that those enzymes which are rate limiting for energy production and are also dependent on B1, they're inhibited for some reason. And it's not because of a deficiency. It can be because of an inflammation. It can be because of oxidative stress. It can be because of some kind of a toxicity, but they're inhibited. And the concept behind using high doses of B1 is that when you give, when you saturate an enzyme, you can activate it once again, even if it's been inhibited. They do this in the genetic research, basically by providing the cell with really high levels, you can get that enzyme to start working as it ordinarily should do again, and that seems to be the kind of leading theory as to how this is working. And frankly, since I started delving into this and doing research on it, I've had hundreds of people get in contact with me. I no longer practice, but when I was practicing, I used this therapy in many people. It tended to be one of the main reasons why people would seek me out. And we would find that oftentimes at lower doses, it would have very few effects, say in a couple of 100 milligrams. But then as you move up to the 1,000 milligrams, 2,000 milligrams, you see that actually these supposedly incurable diseases, people can practically or miraculously improve very quickly. And from my standpoint, I'm confused because no one really talks about this. There are a handful of people who even know the potential benefits of using high doses of B1. A lot of it derives from the work of Dr. Derek Lonsdale and subsequently his co-author Chandler Mars, who have done a lot of research into this. Lonsdale was using it in POTS, so postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and in autism, and he was finding miraculous benefits. And he's been talking about this for decades. Unfortunately, medicine and alternative medicine didn't seem to listen, and no one really talks much about this. So I guess that's one of my reasons why I've kind of taken up a focus. I'd like to ideally raise some awareness of how useful this B vitamin really can be.
Yeah, well, check out his YouTube channel, and that's my friend Michael's story. He, like I mentioned it, it completely changed his life. He could barely move, and now he's 70. I went to his house. He climbed up a rope to the second floor. He's just strong. It changed his life. So that's why, yes, he's trying to create more awareness around it and started that group, and he's funding a research study. He also is backing the Food Lies film. He's a great supporter of my work, but it's so confusing why people haven't caught on to this. I understand why mainstream medicine hasn't caught on to it because it's not, some patentable money-making scheme. But the alternative health space, you said, isn't really onto it either.
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of reasons for it. I mean, one, there's this underlying assumption that you have to develop, with all the B vitamins, there are classical deficiency symptoms. So, for instance, if you develop a niacin deficiency, you develop a condition called pellagra. If you have B12 deficiency, that manifests in a certain way. And it's the same thing for thiamine. There's this underlying assumption that to develop a deficiency, it means that you would go on to develop the end stage symptoms. In this case, it's referred to as either beriberi, which can affect the peripheral nerves. It can cause someone to have peripheral neuropathy, loss of function. They can't move properly. They get tremors, etc. In the case of beriberi of the heart, you develop like a enlarged heart, you develop peripheral edema, etc. There's very specific symptoms that you would develop if you had that condition. Likewise, there's also another condition which is like brain degenerative, and that's called Wernicke encephalopathy. Now, it's thought that these only occur in alcoholics or severely malnourished people, and that's because they do. But it's important to know that there's not a deficiency doesn't, it's not a black or white thing. There's a spectrum, right? You can have a mild insufficiency for a very long time. And I'm not entirely sure, because alternative medicine acknowledges this and they use nutritional supplementation. One reason why it might not be very well known is maybe because it's difficult to test for. Even using functional testing, it can be really difficult to identify a problem. And the main reason for that is because when you have this problem that I've been describing, where you have this kind of intracellular thiamine deficiency, that's not going to show up on systemic tests. For instance, you can test it in the blood. You can look at, even if you do an organic acids test, which is like a functional medicine test, that's only going to show the level of metabolites which is circulating, and then you urinate out. It doesn't tell you what's going on in the brain or the heart, for instance. Now, it's well established that many of the issues that are many of the diseases that are responsive to B1, for instance, Alzheimer's disease, which there's a researcher, his name is Garrett Gibson. He's been, I believe his neuroscience lab is at Berkeley. He's just received like almost $100 million or something crazy like that for his research into using thiamine for Alzheimer's disease. So it's well known in the research field that this can be useful for certain conditions. But his work has shown, and the work of many others, that in those cases, there is not a systemic deficiency. There's not a nutritional deficiency. It's localized or regionalized to certain areas of the body. So it can be regionalized to the heart. It can be regionalized to the brain. That's not going to show up systemically. So thiamine usually comes back normal on testing. In fact, most of the people that I consult with who respond to really high doses, they're not deficient in the nutritional sense, and there's no laboratory evidence for deficiency. And so really, I think that that's probably the main stumbling block, is that this kind of reliance on testing when it's simply not effective. It's not going to tell you what's going on in specific organs. So really, the best way to know if you've got a problem with this or not is to look at your symptoms, which can really be like wide ranging. I mean, like I was saying about these end stage deficiency diseases, like these are like the end of the line. Like people have to be severely deficient to get those. But if you look at one of the earliest human studies on induced thiamine deficiency in man, and this probably wouldn't be allowed now because it was kind of like unethical, but what they did was they got 12 individuals or 8 individuals. They put them on a diet which was only 10% of the amount of thiamine every single day that they should be having, and they just watched them. They watched them for like a month or 2 months or something. And what they found was that none of those people developed beriberi or Wernicke encephalopathy. They thought they would. They were looking at how long it took them to develop this deficiency disease. They found out none of them did. In fact, the majority of them just had very non-specific symptoms, such as fatigue, such as dizziness, such as lethargy or muscle pains, like digestive issues, like if they had constipation or acid reflux or something like that. None of them actually developed this end stage condition. And what that really showed is that people can go for decades at subclinical or kind of suboptimal levels and have these non-specific symptoms without ever having it diagnosed as thiamine deficiency. And this is super common in chronic digestive issues as well. And I mean, like, you would be amazed at the amount of people who have these really like common functional digestive conditions, like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And you have specialists who specialize like in a functional medicine approach to addressing, digestive problems. And the most effective thing I've ever found in addressing these conditions is B1. And like, you go to any website online, you look at any guide, any course, you do the functional medicine training, none of them will look at B1's effect on the gut. But as it turns out, because B1 is so important for the way that the brain is communicating to the rest of the body. If you look at what often goes wrong in these chronic digestive issues, it's usually that there's a lack of communication or a miscommunication between the brain, the vagus nerve, and the enteric nervous system, so the gut. So if you don't have enough B1, one of the first things that happens is that the vagus nerve stops working. Now, the vagus nerve, super important, by the way. It's actually our body's main defense against any form of inflammation. You've got this pathway called the vagal anti-inflammatory pathway. And one of the first things that happens in a B1 deficiency is you lose the ability of the vagus nerve to turn off inflammation. So that's one piece of information which is really important. But again, the vagus nerve is allowing the parasympathetic nervous system, so the rest and digest, which is how we're kind of counteracting the stress response. The vagus nerve is essentially responsible for communicating all of those signals from the brain, calming down the entire system. And one of the things that it does is it tells the stomach to make stomach acid, tells the stomach to propel food at the right times. It tells the intestine to propel food in the right way, and it tells the pancreas to release digestive enzymes, etc. So, I only kind of came across this information by chance, because I'd have people who would come to me on a diet which really should work for them, whether it's keto, whether it's paleo or animal based or carnivore or whatever. All of these kind of dietary approaches, I tend to attract the failures, the people who you don't really hear that much about. You don't see YouTube videos talking about how this diet failed so much. And so those people, they do this diet and they're looking for a solution. They say, well, okay, why is it not helping? Why do I still have chronic burping? Why do I have undigested food in my stool? Why do I have chronic constipation and all of these other kinds of things? It turns out in many of those cases, not everyone, but in many of them, it seems as though that long period of eating suboptimal amounts of thiamine, they develop actually a long-standing dependence, and that using this or replenishing this can fix the problem in literally days, So, yeah, sorry if I went off on a bit of a tangent there.
No, I love it. No, this is all such good info. This is how I understood that. I mean, it's almost a panacea. You know what I mean? It's like it should be more of a first line of defense, possibly. I love functional medicine practitioners, and they do all kinds of interesting stuff. But you're saying, hey, what's the downside in just looking into thiamine? Maybe that can solve a lot of your problems, and then maybe you could go and solve the rest of them. But it seems like there's, from what I've seen, and I've talked to a lot of people in the last year about this, kind of, because I've been onto your work and just this stuff in general, and it's amazing what it can do. Is there any reason why people can't just take a bunch of thiamine and see if things get better?
No, there's not. That's the thing. I mean, it's so safe. I mean, you can take thousands and thousands of milligrams without any identifiable side effects. The kidney is really quite excellent at getting rid of what the body doesn't need. Now, of course, you might develop side effects like diarrhea, which can be the case in some people, simply because their body is kind of excreting if they take a massive dose. But that's super uncommon. Really, when it comes to all of the things that someone can try, it really should be one of the first things, simply because, based on the concept that if the body has everything that it needs to work, then chances are it can work quite well. And oftentimes, what we call diseases or, some kind of dysfunction, it can just be that the body doesn't have enough of what it has. And I think people take for granted the fact that many of the people who come to them have been on diets which are like the standard American diet, which is like they're on this diet for sometimes decades, and then they all of a sudden make the switch really quickly to some kind of like whole foods or a more healthy kind of evolutionarily consistent diet, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
But not all of the things in their body change. There's this period of adaptation, but it seems as though someone can still carry over a lot of those effects or a lot of those kind of factors that were happening over the past 2 decades, carry it over with them, and they don't necessarily get better on the diet that's meant to fix everything. And whilst these diets are amazing, I mean, I personally advise, definitely animal based, whichever kind of approach that's going to be. But really, oftentimes it's like you can give someone the best diet in the world, but if they can't digest it and they can't absorb that, then it's kind of irrelevant what they're eating. And so really we want to make sure that they can actually obtain the benefits that they need to obtain. And then, if there is this kind of issue, like a chronic inflammation or something that doesn't respond, maybe it's the case that, well, the vagus nerve might not be able to turn down inflammation. Maybe it's, if they've got neurological issues, maybe it is the case that they have this kind of underlying functional thiamine deficiency in the brain, which isn't really going to get fixed by the diet. I've not seen it happen in any cases so far. So it seems as though there's really no reason not to try this. In fact, it's the only way to know. And people kind of like, they can't understand that. They go to the doctor and they ask for a test, and the test comes back normal, and they say, oh, well, maybe this wasn't my thing, I'm not going to try it. I actually run a group. It's a small group. I only started a couple of months ago on Facebook. But we have lots of people kind of explaining that situation. And the only advice that anyone ever gives is, no, you need to try this. And more times than not, if they have the symptoms, even if the test comes back normal, they have the symptoms, then they respond well to the B1. So
Yeah. So this stuff makes so much sense to me. So you're talking about the standard American diet. Yes. So standard American diet can cause so many problems, and all the gut problems and chronic disease and weight gain and all that stuff. And it's nutritionally deficient. And then you go to a good diet, like you're saying, ancestral diets. I just lump them as ancestral diets. Sounds like you agree. It's animal based, whole foods. It's like anywhere from paleo to keto to carnivore. Exactly what I believe in Sapien. I call it the Sapien diet, Sapien framework. It's basically just, let's get you in one of these categories and tailor it to you, right? It's not like everyone has to do the same version of it, but there's this ancestrally consistent thing. So that will solve a lot of those problems. They can allow people to lose weight and heal some gut problems and do all kinds of stuff, but it's not going to give them enough thiamine. Like, I'm not into supplementation, but this is one of the few times when like this makes so much sense, where your body's been depleted for so long and you just need to jack it up with high doses, and you don't have to do it forever. I understand. And then you can have, organ meats and other foods. I understand pork and like dark meat, chicken, stuff like that has thiamine, and you can, you just need that boost, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's how it seems. And it's really kind of strange, especially people who are very set in their kind of, let's say, ideological stance when it comes to diet and health. This idea that as soon as you get back to ancestral principles, then automatically, you don't need to supplement anything. Why should a human being have to supplement if we weren't supplementing 10,000 years ago or something? Yeah. And it's like, well, okay, but we kind of live in a different environment now, and maybe it's something there. The reason for why that is because what you described is kind of how it plays out in certain people. They go on they change the diet, they try to improve, but they find out that their symptoms don't improve necessarily. They might see some improvements, but really they're not where they want to be. And it could be chronic fatigue syndrome, it can be fibromyalgia, it could be any number of symptoms that they still have. And so what they might do is they might take thiamine, and these people usually do develop what's called a paradoxical reaction. And that is, it's called paradoxical because it actually makes them feel worse before they get better. And that's almost a given. I discuss this in my videos and on my documents and things like that. Basically, it seems to be a rule that some people, they get worse, their symptoms actually, they intensify for a certain period of time, and then they only gradually get better. We don't know exactly why this is. It's super confusing. There is a theory, Derek Lonsdale, who really pioneered the use of high dose thiamine for different conditions. What he believes is that you have biochemical adaptations. You think about it, you've only got a certain amount of resources, right? So to maintain an enzyme, for instance, it can be a very resource intensive process. It's like if you only have a certain amount of B1 coming in for a significant period of time, at least to me, it makes intuitive sense that the body will adapt to that level. So it will say, okay, we've only got this certain amount coming in, and therefore we're going to kind of down-regulate lots of different processes to match the amount that we actually have. But then all of a sudden, when you give the body super high amounts, what this, it's kind of like shocking the system. It's almost like conveying the message that, okay, now we have enough, we can start doing things properly. And from that point onwards, then you someone goes through kind of like this adaptation phase where their body is reintegrating or readjusting to this new level. Things start working again, things come back online, and then they can wean themselves off and they don't require it long term. Like, that's usually the case. I mean, I've had several carnivores who've come to me, we do high dose thiamine for a month, 2 months, 3 months, gradually wean down, and they don't need it any longer. They've gotten to a point where they feel great and they're not dependent on it. Now, that's not necessarily the case with something like Parkinson's disease or fibromyalgia. Sometimes in those
Mm.
cases, they need to remain on it
Hmm.
permanently. Otherwise, their symptoms return. So for those people, it's a little bit more complicated. I'm not sure exactly what is happening. They're dependent on it. They're not worse than when they started, but ultimately, the thiamine is being used as a crutch. Now, it's a crutch that can help them get out of bed every morning, and so it's a useful crutch. But at the same time, it's not
Hmm.
getting to the root cause. Those are probably in the minority of people. But yeah, it really does. It's one of those things which kind of never fails to surprise me, and that's really one of the reasons why I continue trying to understand it. It doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah. Well, it's great. I mean, we'll get to the bottom of it eventually. I'm sure more research will be done on it, but in the meantime, it's like, hey, it works and it's safe, and why not try it? And I think it's great. And again, this guy Michael, he noticed it in the carnivore world. Is that a lot of people who, yeah, were having problems that they couldn't resolve. It did resolve with thiamine. It's like that was the one thing they needed, and it's just you can't get it from all the food. I guess just what we're saying. So, and also it's interesting. You said it could get worse before it gets better. That leads to oxalates. I don't know if we should jump to oxalates just yet, but that's another thing where it can get worse before it gets better. And I had Sally Norton on years and years ago, and it kind of blew my mind because, man, I got caught up in this whole spinach and kale shake thing years ago with almond milk, and I did it for years straight. And I must have had, hundreds and hundreds of milligrams of oxalate per day. So bad. And I think I'm still dealing with issues from it. But there are some symptoms, right? And dumping symptoms. And I guess we did just transition into oxalates.
It's a real thing, man. Some people don't believe it. They still don't believe it. It's a real thing, and it's brutal because it lasts so long. I mean, this concept that your body can accumulate something without you knowing it, without any identifiable symptoms, that's the worst thing. It's insidious. That's why I think it's the worst, and it's the most dangerous plant toxin. Some people disagree with me on that, but I think many people do agree. I'm in complete agreement with Sally Norton. I think she's a wonderful human being for raising so much awareness on this, because it it happens behind the scenes without anyone even knowing it. So they think that they're being healthy, and this can go on for years. It can go on for decades, and then all of a sudden something happens, usually some kind of a trigger, some kind of a stressor, and then they identify these like very strange symptoms, which progressively get worse, and that gets like 10 times worse when they reduce oxalate, which is, again, it's kind of paradoxical, like you said, because you'd think that when you like an example would be lectins or phytates. For instance, lectins, for instance, if you're having a problem with autoimmune flares due to lectins found in certain vegetables and plants and things, if you stop eating those fairly quickly on, you're going to notice an improvement in autoimmunity. But with oxalate, it's usually the opposite. So when you stop eating it, as you know, you get this honeymoon period, and then all of a sudden you get this like severe worsening of symptoms. And for some people, they might think that's due to the diet change. They might think, well, actually, I need to be eating more spinach because if I don't eat spinach, then my joints hurt. So then they end up making the problem significantly worse. Yeah, I mean, we made the transition to oxalate, but that's another area of research which I'm super interested in. Again, as you probably know, being a health coach, you tend to attract a certain population of people. So for me, it tends to be people who B1 responsive or who respond in that way, and also people in oxalates. And that's probably because I've got a bunch of videos on both topics and things. But basically, there's an overlap between two topics. It's interesting. If you, I don't know if you're part of the Trying Low Oxalate group on Facebook. Aside from Sally Norton, she's probably the most famous in this area. There's also another researcher who's been going very deep into the science for decades now. Her name is Susan Owens, and she again is another marvelous. She's a scientist through and through, right? So she will go down right into the details and the mechanisms and things. And she doesn't shy away from sharing those with people. And what her research has uncovered is that there does tend to be a strong overlap between people with thiamine problems and oxalate, and that really is perhaps due to the diet, but more likely how much the body actually makes. So here's something that I think a lot of people get wrong: is they think that to have a problem with oxalates, you need to be on a diet which is high in oxalates, and if it's not, or if it's not been historically, then you probably don't have a problem. Really, that's incorrect. I think that the concept that the body makes its own oxalate and that can also accumulate is just as pertinent, and probably maybe not quite as common, but certainly very common in chronic disease. For instance, if you look at the effects of, like, in long-term thiamine deficiency, well, what ends up happening is the cells start making their own oxalate. They start generating more oxalate, and thiamine is one of the things that protects against endogenous oxalate production. It's also one of the things that, if you don't have enough of it, then you can develop an oxalate problem. Susan has done a lot of research into this area, but also, if you look at something as common as atherosclerosis or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, now there's some more recent research. Scientists who are now looking at atherosclerosis as a problem of too much endogenous oxalate production. So there was a study which was looking at how much the liver actually makes in non-alcoholic fatty liver and any other kind of metabolic syndrome. It turns out that when someone has fat deposits around the liver and around the liver, and they have atherosclerosis, they are generating massive amounts of oxalate, which is completely independent from the diet. Again, if you look at obesity, people who have obesity, if they have inflammation in the gut, this is also one of the things that can prevent the body from getting rid of the oxalate that it does make and cause it to accumulate. So one thing that I am interested in, I mean, you've probably spoken a lot about oxalates and dumping and things with Sally, but this concept that the body makes its own, and under conditions of stress, under conditions of disease, it also makes quite a lot. That seems to be where the research is kind of focused. And one thing that tends to indicate, or seems to indicate at least, is that people can think that they don't have a problem with oxalates, but in fact, if they have an underlying health condition, then they might actually have a problem with it. And going on a low oxalate diet is just as merited as if they had previously been high oxalate in their diet, if that makes sense. So you have two people. You have someone who's eaten very high oxalates for a long period of time. They need to go on a low oxalate diet to get it out of the body. You also have someone who maybe has not eaten a lot of oxalates, but their body has been endogenously producing it because it's under chronic stress, inflammation, any kind of disease, thiamine deficiency, B6 deficiency, etc. In that situation, the body will still retain oxalate, and they also need to go on a low oxalate diet. So I think it's probably a lot more common than even many people think, even, despite people, or let's say outside of the context of high oxalate diets, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And yeah, I've been on a low oxalate diet for, I guess, 3.5 years now. It's basically just what we said earlier, the Sapien diet, Sapien framework. It's animal based, nose to tail, eating organs, marrow, fat, all that stuff, plus the low anti-nutrient foods, and just which could be like fruits or sweet potatoes have kind of high oxalate. It's avoiding like spinach, almonds, dark chocolate. What are just some like quick ones I didn't list?
So spinach, chard, what else? Rhubarb, starfruit, kiwi fruit, berries, so raspberries. Depends on the variety of any of these foods, by the way. So there are some foods which are like high across the board, spinach, for instance, but also some other foods like blueberries, which can be high and they can also be low, depending on where they're grown, depending on the conditions of the growth, etc.
Mm.
But sweet potato, white potato. Um, what else do we have? Grains. Most grains are high. Basically, all nuts. Most nuts. Macadamia depends on the
Mm.
variety, but generally nuts are completely off the list. Tea seeds. Yeah, a lot
Seeds?
of seeds. There's some seeds that aren't high. For instance, hemp seeds are high, but pumpkin seeds or sunflower seeds can be low. Although I wouldn't necessarily
Mm-hmm.
advise eating sunflower seeds anyway. Generally, animal foods across the
Mm-hmm.
board are low. But really, it's
Yep.
what else you have? The spices. They're probably one of the hidden
Mm-hmm.
sources. So turmeric, very 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 high. Cumin, um, caraway seed, black pepper, uh, and it adds up. So a low oxalate diet being
Mm-hmm.
approximately 50 to 100 milligram per day. You can quite easily, if you're consuming a lot of these spices in conjunction with a sweet potato or beetroot is another thing that's pretty high. You can quite easily surpass 500, 600, 700 milligrams per day. Now people who are doing the green juices, they can easily surpass 1 to 1 to 1.5 grams of oxalate. Now, not all of that is going to be absorbed,
Yeah.
but ultimately, that's when you're getting into the real danger zone. And that's where you'll see some case studies of people who've juiced spinach, for instance. Spinach is just like usually always involved, right? It's like any of the case studies, you see
Yeah.
acute kidney failure after juicing or after a vegetable smoothie or something. It's always spinach. But yeah, people who are doing these juices, they cause very significant injury, acute injury to the kidney, and some people have died, right? So it's not a thing to mess around with. But unfortunately, as you probably know, a lot of the research into oxalate poisoning is only really focused on the kidneys. The idea that the body will actually retain it elsewhere systemically in the bones, in the soft tissue, etc. This is overlooked. Most people don't know anything about this, especially the researchers. It's only basically all of the information we have about this is looking at a genetic condition called a primary hyperoxaluria, where the body makes too much of its own. But it's well established in that condition that um, that you can retain oxalate in basically practically every single organ and every single type of tissue. And then if you were to give one of those patients a a liver transplant, for instance, and you get that oxalate level down, then you'll see that periodically they will go through this kind of high urine level, low urine level, or high blood level, low blood level. And that's reflective of this body, of this process of what's called dumping, which I'm sure your listeners know about. But it's essentially when the body is no longer eating a high amount of oxalate, when there's only a certain threshold is met, then the body will start dumping what's stored in tissue by resolubilizing it. It dumps it into the blood, and this is scientifically verified. Like, this does happen. This isn't just a construct. There's a body of literature. I mean, Sally Norton has got a book coming out very soon, and I believe she'll cover all of this. But there is a body of scientific literature which shows that this does categorically happen. But yeah, essentially, you will you will dump from what's been stored into the blood, and then you can get rid of it. You can get rid of it basically through every orifice, so it can come out through the kidneys, which is well known, and that might cause cloudy urination. But it can also come out through the skin, and it can come out through the eyes, come out through the saliva, the gut, and oftentimes the people, or the route of excretion, it will be causing some kind of an irritation or some kind of an inflammatory event wherever it's coming out of the body. So, for instance, if it's coming out the gut, then someone might develop very strong diarrhea. In fact, that was my main symptom when I did a carnivore diet a couple of years ago. I developed like severe watery diarrhea for no apparent reason. And I didn't have a problem eating fat. I'd been keto on and off for like
Hmm.
4 or 5 years before that. And I had no problem
Hmm.
consuming high amounts of fat. There was something else that was going on. And I actually only discovered that by eating oxalate containing food did it immediately stop. And this is the case with all kinds of symptoms that people get. They might periodically notice a flare up of their joint pain or itchy eyes or uh, any kind of a skin rash or something like that. And they find that this kind of periodically goes up and down. It can really occur for decades, well, years, up to there was one study
Hmm.
looking at the fluctuation in the blood level, and they that was like 160 months. They found a gradual reduction, but it was fluctuating up and down. So Sally Norton's correct in saying that for some people it can take up to 5 to 10 years to fully get rid of oxalate from the body, or what's been stored.
It's it's so true. It's scary. Dr. Bill Schindler, who's been on my show a bunch of times, told his story of crazy eye problems and couldn't barely see, and it was the oxalates, and he figured it out, and it went away. And I had my own story. There's so many stories about this. And you wait, before we move on, you said that eating some more oxalate can help. That's a little bit paradoxical to some people. And I've heard about this. If you can't eat a little more, it could stop the
Yeah.
symptoms while you're
So it's
dumping.
really based on the concept that when you're eating a chronically high oxalate diet, what's being absorbed, or let's say you're making your own. Either way, basically your blood level of oxalate is at a certain level. Okay, when it's at a certain level, only so much of that is going to be excreted from the kidneys. So say you're eating high oxalate foods chronically, you're not going to be getting rid of all of that from the kidneys. There's certain ways that the body can get rid of this, but most of the time there's going to be some level of kind of accumulation. So whilst the blood oxalate level is high, it will be traveling around the body, and before it even gets to the kidneys, it can become attracted to sites of inflammation. It can be deposited in the blood vessels, for instance, or in the muscles or something like that, right? And now the trigger for the body releasing its own is when that level goes too low. So, for instance, if it's chronically high, you
Mhm.
stop eating oxalate, all of a sudden your blood level will start to go low. And after it's been low, and it's not an exact science for how long it needs to be low for someone to start getting rid of what's been stored. But basically, when it goes so low,
Mhm.
then the body, there's a signal, and I don't know if it's been characterized, but there's some kind of a message that cells receive that tells them it's now safe to to dump. So you say an example would be
Mhm.
from the bone or from the connective tissue. Someone goes on a low oxalate diet. 3 weeks later, their connective tissue starts dumping out stored oxalate. And what that does is it temporarily props up the blood level again. Okay. The problem is that if someone has a very severe case of oxalate overload, then that dumping that's triggering the inflammatory response. You see, oxalate is a toxin. So when oxalate is dumped into the blood, that's identified by the immune system. It can cause all kinds of symptoms. Now, in some cases, they can be so severe that it can cause someone to go to the emergency room. I've had like countless individuals who think that they're having a heart attack. So is Sally, so is Susan Owens, so is any practitioner who knows anything about oxalate. If someone drops it too quickly, then because what's happening is when you dump it into the blood, it's triggering inflammation, but it's also binding with many of our electrolytes. So it binds with potassium, for instance, causes potassium depletion, binds with sodium, binds with magnesium. It can cause very strong depletion of these electrolytes, which you need. So in this kind of situation, if someone drops oxalate too quickly, they often find that the symptoms can be so severe because of this kind of overall set of events that happen, that when you eat oxalate containing food, that props up the blood level again and slows down the process of the body dumping it.
Yeah. I know a practitioner here who has to eat a small amount of oxalates every week. And he's like, oh, I'm going to eat this amount of sweet potatoes or something, or it's too severe. And actually, I mean, remain anonymous, obviously, but I posted this on Instagram with his permission that he collected his urine in a jar and then dumped it through a coffee filter.
Yeah.
And there's just oxalate crystals, just a huge pile of oxalate crystals. And he's been dealing with this for years and years. And well, a lot of people don't know. Actually, when I talked to Sally Norton, I mentioned a vegan website that I found warning people of oxalates. So they were warning the vegans about plant anti-nutrients, which I thought was kind of funny. But that's how I know it's not just something, the carnivore community made up.
Right.
It's super real. And a lot of people have kidney stones, right? I think that's one of the most famous versions of, oxalate damage is they bind with the calcium, like you were
Yeah.
saying, into these different minerals and electrolytes, and then they can come out. And I guess I should tell my story really quick because I did the kale and spinach and almond milkshakes for many years ago. 3.5 years, nothing. Then some company sent me some like meat sticks or something to try. And they're like, oh, here's this like green powder, oxalate powder, basically, those like green juice powder things. So I'm like, hey, I haven't had any of this stuff in 3.5 years. What if I just eat it? And I eat the same thing every day, right? That my diet is the same pretty much. Like there's no reason anything else would happen. This was the only thing I did differently in the entire world was I tried this stupid drink. I drank the drink, woke up in the middle of the night. I was like passing a kidney stone. It was the worst pain. I was up for a couple hours. It was like peeing fire.
Right.
Like it was cloudy. It was just like the worst thing ever. And then that was it. And that was just the cute trigger. So I've never talked. I wanted to talk to Sally about it, but I guess I'm talking to you now. So what happened? So I just drank the one drink and boom.
Yeah, I mean, depending on what the drink contained, I mean, if it was a super, what you find is that a lot of those green
It was just like
powders.
it was like green spinach. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was all the concentrates of.
Okay, so basically, right, the kidneys are the main excretion route for oxalate. Oxalate being a plant toxin, it doesn't have any known function in the human body. Now, in some people, if you have enough calcium in the gut, then it can prevent it from being absorbed. But if you look at something like spinach, a lot of it is absorbable. It's in its soluble form. So, for instance, if you have one of these green powder things, chances are you're going to be absorbing quite a lot of that. So that's going to, it can be absorbed through the stomach. It's absorbed in the upper small intestine, and it's going to enter into portal circulation. It's going to travel around the body before it gets to the kidneys. So the kidneys are the main route of excretion, but before it gets anywhere else, it's going to go to lots of other places. Okay, that's the first thing. But the kidney only has a finite capacity to excrete this stuff. So oftentimes, what will happen, like you said, the most common sign or the most well-known manifestation of oxalate problems is that it causes kidney stones, these crystals. But a kidney stone is like a very, very, very large example of something that can happen, which is super common and can cause pain and irritation and burning and those symptoms that you identified, which is oxalate doesn't just form stones. Stones are like the end stage of crystals. Oxalate can ordinarily what it's going to form is crystals which can be as small as nanocrystals, which can penetrate into the cell. But basically, as you're peeing out these nanocrystals, they can lodge in the urethra. They can trigger the inflammatory response in the bladder. They can cause oxidative stress and damage to the kidneys. You don't need to have kidney stones to be getting damaged by oxalate, right? It's like only a few people ever even get kidney stones, and oftentimes it's because their urine doesn't contain enough citrate, and therefore they can't like prevent the accumulation of these crystals into stones. But basically, yeah, as you're peeing out these crystals, it causes damage on the way out wherever it's going. Like any orifice that is excreting oxalate can be damaged because of that. So, like you described, felt like you're peeing out fire or it was burning. Oftentimes, this is the root cause of people with interstitial cystitis. This condition, which is like basically they've got all of the symptoms of a urinary tract infection, but they never test positive for a UTI. So, for instance, they've got this like chronic burning in the bladder. Whenever they go to urinate, they feel like it stings and it causes all of this pain. I developed that after I started going carnivore. Like you, I also had a period where I was like spinach and blah, 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 blah. I used to eat copious amounts of 90% dark chocolate, like insane amounts. And dark chocolate is like super high. And at the same time, I had like some gut issues as well. So I think that my absorption levels were massive. I wasn't eating any dairy, which again is a risk factor for someone developing a problem with this, because it also has high amounts of calcium. So ultimately, yeah, urinary issues, bladder issues, urinary tract infections are super common in people with oxalate problems. You think it's like peeing
Mhm.
out shards of glass, right? That's essentially what this is.
Oh, I know exactly what it is. What are some other symptoms? Because we kind of glossed over it a little bit. You mentioned joint pain, but like if people, because again, it's super hard to diagnose. No one looks for it. What kind of problems do people see?
Yeah, okay. So it can I mean it can basically be, it can range any system in the body that's affected. um Common symptoms, so common symptoms are going to be pain of any kind, and this can be chronic. Usually it's cyclical, and it can affect any part of the body. So it can be neuropathic pain, so neuropathy, burning, tingling. It can be muscle pain. It can be joint pain. It can be, like we've just spoken about, kidney or bladder pain. Or it can be, for women, a very common sign and symptom is what's called vulvodynia, which is where the tissue of the vagina becomes inflamed and stings, and etc. So pain,
Mm.
super common. Another one is any kind of calcification. So if someone has, for instance, arterial calcification, that can be a sign of oxalates. If they have strange nodules, bumps in the muscles, strange like calcifications. Sometimes people might describe when they're feeling around the muscles, they can hear grit. Right. So, for instance,
Mm.
if you turn your neck and you feel it's gritty, or you can sometimes even feel crystals in the foot. I
Mm.
had one lady who, after whenever she had a foot massage, it felt that the massage therapist would tell her that she felt as though there were crystals, like sharp crystals,
Mm.
when she was massaging. So any kind of a calcification, it can be digestive issues, super common. And the reason for this is because what oxalate is absorbed uh, also can be excreted. So it has to be excreted in the small intestine or in the large intestine. And when it's dumped back into the gut, it can cause irritation. So it can cause bleeding on the way out. For instance, if someone thinks that they have hemorrhoids, it can sometimes actually be the oxalate being dumped into the feces, and on its way out is causing like microabrasions. Okay. Like
Mm.
itchy anus and things like that. It can also cause in this small intestine. It's been known to induce like a form of dysbiosis. So if someone has a SIBO, or if they have any issue with their neurological system in the gut, which again, kind of odd, major kind of overlap with thiamine. But basically, oxalate,
Mhm.
what it can do is, as it's being absorbed through the stomach, it can actually lodge into the nerves, and it causes like nerve firing problems. So if you lose the ability to properly control the functions of the digestive organs, if you have like reflux, if you have gut pain, if you have like motility problems, that again can be caused by oxalate. So really, any kind of gut issue, and even the form of oxalate, if you're not absorbing it, even if it's bound with calcium in the gut, which is considered to be protective, it's still abrasive, right? It's still going to be abrasive, and it can still kind of scrape the insides of the intestines and cause any kind of a gut pain or anything like that. So
Mm.
digestive issues, pain of any kind, calcifications. Another super common issue is problems with the heart. That seems to be an issue. So, for
Mm.
instance, it can affect the heart. It can affect the electrical conductance of the heart. That seems to be a problem. The vascular system. One of the main symptoms that I personally developed, and that I've seen in a couple of other people, is a condition called acrocyanosis. What this basically means is that the blood vessels lose the ability to respond to the nervous system. So you end up with like excessive vasodilation or excessive constriction at the wrong times. So if someone has a problem with circulation, this is really, 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 really common in the oxalate community, because oxalate traveling through the blood ultimately it can be lodging or calcifying the blood vessels, and this kind of makes them less responsive to hormones and nerve signals and things. Um, re- Injuries which don't get better. So, for instance, if someone has a chronic shoulder injury or what's called repetitive strain injury, oftentimes they see cyclical improvement and worsening if they go on a low oxalate diet. Oftentimes, because oxalate is attracted to the area of injury, and in that case, if you have oxalate deposits in a particular area, that's going to cause like a mechanical stress. It does get into the cells, it causes lots of other kinds of issues, but ultimately it causes inflammation in that area. And that could be one of the reasons why someone has this injury that doesn't really respond to anything else.
Mm. And then rashes. You said some skin issues
Yeah,
too.
that seems to be pretty common, but usually I see that more often when someone's dumping. So basically, when someone's dumping, again, whichever orifice oxalate is being excreted through, that's where you're going to see symptoms. Some people can like you mentioned, a guy who has like really irritated eyes. I've never experienced that, but I've seen many people who do have that. That's because oxalate is literally coming out in the eyes. Usually in the morning time, they feel as though there's grit. Again, that causes microabrasions around the eyelid, on the eyeball, even itself. Oftentimes, people, when they dump, if it's being excreted into the saliva, then it's going to be binding with calcium in the saliva and forming like a calcified plaque on the teeth. So people find that they one of the metrics they know for when they're dumping is that they develop like a more tartar, more dental plaque, which seemingly comes like very quickly, and they have no idea what caused it, and they get it cleaned off, and then all of a sudden it comes again. That's really odd.
Mm.
Another thing is usually like you said, cloudy urine, or some people even like white colored urine, which is kind of odd, but it's so cloudy that it's basically they're just peeing out masses of crystals. Digestive issues, diarrhea. Um, in some cases, it's like sandy stools, so it looks as though when they go to the toilet, they look at what's in there. It seems as though there's literally like grains of sand, like kind of
Mm.
like. And again, not
Mhm.
sure what kind of. They're not sure what that is, but that tends to be super common. Pale stools. Another condition which oxalate seems to be super important in is autism. There's been a couple of papers written on that. Susan Owens done a lot of work into that. Um, Really, it can affect
I have
every
two
organ.
more. Yeah, because you're talking about how can come out in different orifices. I remember when I interviewed Sally, I stopped eating oxalates 2 weeks before, or whatever, 1 week before, while I was doing research on her. And then without her telling me, she's like brought up in the show about peeling fingers. And I looked down and I was like, wait, every single finger was completely peeled all around the edges. And so that was crazy. And I think that's happened to me a little bit. I think I am still having problems dumping with them because my eyes, just the past couple months, out of nowhere, my eyes, I wake up, like you said, exactly. All this stuff's coming out of my eyes every morning.
Right. And I mean, the average person, like, they have no framework by which to understand why that is happening. You
Oh,
can
yeah.
see how like no one would put two and two together and say, oh, well, this must be because of what I've eaten. Most people don't
Years
even
ago.
know about it, and a lot of
Yeah.
people who do know about it, they dismiss it as nonsense. So I mean, that's super interesting what you described, and really super common. Um, yeah. Another thing that is also common is dental issues. In fact, some people, if they've got like a periodontitis or like bone loss around the jaw or around the teeth for no apparent reason, or like decalcification of the teeth, like that is another really frequent thing that you see in these people who do juices. And it's not necessarily because they eat really acidic foods or anything like that. It's because oxalate is literally leaching the calcium from the body, right? That's one of the main things it does. It steals minerals from the body, and one of those is it binds it up with calcium. So really, anywhere that you have calcium in high amounts, for instance, in the bone, really oxalate can cause a problem. That kind of like leads us to another thing, which is like bone problems, for like some kind of an osteoporosis or maybe increased risk for fracture. gum issues. Again, it can foster the overgrowth of bacteria around the gums and around the teeth. So yeah, it's really pretty pesky, and
Mhm.
and again, it's one of the only way that you can really tell. I don't put my faith in any tests. I've done hundreds of organic acids tests on people, and I'm not convinced that's the best way. Really, like thiamine, the only way to tell is to try it. And to try it, really,
Mhm.
a low oxalate diet, you should probably try it for at least 5 or 6 months, like at least, because it can take a long time for the body to start kind of like getting rid of this stuff.
Mhm. Well, I think it's not a high risk because I think a low oxalate diet is just a healthy diet. It's kind of a low oxalate diet is a animal-based, low anti-nutrient diet. Basically, you're eating, simple whole foods and all the animal foods, and I think people will do well on that no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, it's super difficult if someone is vegan. You know, like if
Oh, I don't have vegans in my audience. No, no, no.
I know, but there's a whole community of them, like low oxalate vegans. Like you said, you went onto that website
Yeah,
and you
their
saw.
website, yeah.
I mean, like, I don't even know how you would do that. That must be like impossible because you have to reduce it a certain amount every week, let's say, and you get to a zero oxalate diet. But to do that, to be on a or 50 milligrams like a low oxalate diet as a vegan is so difficult because most plants contain oxalate first of all, and then to
Mhm,
get all of like your protein, not that you necessarily even can, but to
mhm.
get like a certain amount of protein and the B vitamins, the minerals, etc. I mean, it's like it's impossible. I don't know anyone who can successfully do that, and there are people who try, but I mean, like that's insane level of difficulty. Like you really
Well,
need to be eating animal foods, like just to make this
yeah.
possible. To make it work.
Well, that's my crowd. We're all about the animal foods. So this nutrition stuff, so interesting to me because both of these problems with low thiamine or high oxalate, it's like you never really know until it's too late. And that's what's so fascinating to me about nutrition in general. It's kind of like this never-ending puzzle of trying to figure out what's going on because so many people have these problems and they can go on a good diet and it can fix the big things. Like it can fix your metabolic health, right? Like these good sapien style diets, you can fix your metabolic health. You'll lose weight. You can do so many things, but there's this whole new things that could pop up or unresolved issues. And then you have to get in the weeds. And I don't know if you've picked thiamine and oxalate on purpose, almost because they could be the biggest things that people don't really know about that can benefit them.
Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. I think it's the kind of natural inquisitiveness, like to think that there's this sorry, my earphones are coming out. To
Mhm,
think that there's so many people who could benefit. I think partly the reason, I studied nutrition and I followed, lots of the big thinkers in nutrition for a very long time, trying to answer these questions. Part of it, I think, is a dissatisfaction with the kind of current models, seeing that there's some people who you work with and they just don't get better and you don't really know why. So there's that element of it. Also the mystery, maybe that's what it is, the mystery involved there to see, there's a lot of things that we don't know, and kind of being um uh, comfortable with that. It's like there's a lot of things that we
mhm,
don't know, and you can be a
mhm,
bookworm and you can try to understand things theoretically, but at some point you have to just say, look, no one understands this. We're all learning, and we have to
mhm,
go back to the kind of old fashioned way of practicing, and listen to someone, listen to what they say, listen to their body, listen to trust that there's things that science hasn't figured out yet. So we don't understand what's going on all of the time. We can't necessarily explain things through
mhm,
mechanisms. It's like, well, actually, anecdote I think is really um, is the most important guiding factor, like listening to what people say in their experience. And that's one of the criticisms when it comes to the thiamine stuff and the oxalate stuff, is if it's coming from practitioners or even scientists, they'll say, well, look, show me the studies.
mhm,
And it's like,
mhm,
dude, that's not a good argument against what I'm saying. Like, if there's thousands of people who experience something, chances are like there's an element of truth to it. Now, our understanding of the mechanism might be completely wrong, but we have a good idea that it's happening. So either we can try to
Mhm.
understand how it's happening and try to implement like things which can help people, or we wait for studies, we wait decades for some scientific study to tell us what to do. It's like, well,
That no one's ever gonna fund
exactly.
because it's just about eating real
Yeah.
foods or, you know.
Yeah, totally. So maybe that's why. I don't know. But it seems as though both of them do seem to be pretty effective in some people. Now, I'm not under the impression that oxalate is a problem for everyone, because I think in a natural environment, I mean, it seems to be the case that um, there are populations of indigenous people or whatever who consume high amounts of oxalates, maybe not grams, but they consume several hundred milligrams every day, and they don't seem to have a problem. So clearly
Mhm.
there are predisposing factors, and I think it's overall modern lifestyles which either enhance absorption or uh, suppress your body's ability to get rid of it, or it's just all of the added stresses put together make the body more susceptible. Either way, like, I'm not under the impression that oxalate is the big baddie and that everyone is effective and that it's the cause of all health problems. It's just one of the things that is super common and that not really many people even know about.
Mhm.
Same as the B1.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, yeah, because some people, it's like, "Oh, it's only oxalates," or some people, they're like, "I'm gonna debunk everything you believe in because I know a guy that eats high oxalates and is fine." And yeah, I and I get that. And also I interviewed Dr. William Davis, and he's into the gut bacteria stuff, and he was talking about Oxalobacter, or I think something around Oxalobacter strain that can eat, eat up
Yeah.
the oxalate, and that some people have this. And yeah, I think disrupted guts is a part of not being able to handle oxalates well. And I think the modern way of eating, like the way I did it, was not traditional at all. Like guzzling the shake every single day, year
Hmm.
round. If people eat some Swiss chard or some kale or spinach when it's in season, that's fine, right? I mean, it could be fine. You have a few potatoes once in a while. If you do it evolutionary consistent, I think it's totally fine because you give that time to get it out of your system and it never builds up into high amounts.
Yeah, indeed. And those are excellent points. I mean, like the gut bacteria, I think is probably like a really, 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 really important contributor for helping the body maintain oxalate homeostasis. And of course, many of us have been exposed to antibiotics which have like disrupting effects. Glyphosate, all of the other kind of toxins which have
Mhm.
antibiotic effects in the gut. So that's super important. But one of the things that I think people stumble on, and I was tagged on a post on Instagram like a couple of weeks ago. I won't say who it was. It was basically this guy who's saying, "Oh, oxalates are debunked. You're basically the main problem with oxalates is gut dysbiosis. If you fix your gut, then oxalates are no longer a problem for you." And it's like, dude, no, that's not how it works. It's like, in an ideal world, okay, if someone has gut bacteria, specific population, or they have like a healthy microbiome, if they have all of these other things in place, then fantastic. They might be like protected against developing oxalate issues as long as they don't go crazy with smoothies or juices or anything like that. But people who have a problem with this, it's already too late. Like, changing your gut bacteria does not get rid of what's been accumulated or stored in the body. So, by definition, if someone's got a problem with oxalate, it's too late for dealing with gut bacteria. That's like a thing, that's a preventative strategy. That's not a way to deal with the problem. The only way that I know of, unless there's some magical, hyperbaric oxygen therapy that dissolves oxalates or
Mhm.
something, the only way that I know of is to go, sorry, is to go on a low oxalate diet. And if you go on a low oxalate diet, then that's the trigger for getting it out of the body. Like, replenishing, they've even tried this, they've tried to replenish levels of oxalobacter in the gut. First of all, it doesn't colonize very well. But even then, if someone has, like, there's a bunch of people who've done microbiome stool analysis, right? And they find that they have normal levels of oxalobacter, but they have an oxalate problem. I mean, first of all, if you look at how it's absorbed in the stomach and the small intestine. The oxalobacter is in the large intestine, so it can help the body get rid of what it is secreting through the gut. But it really is like a small part of the puzzle in terms of dealing with the problem when it's already there. So I would say that anyone who makes that argument to downplay the significance of oxalates in someone who has a problem with it, they simply don't understand what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, that happens a lot on social media, especially with nutrition. Everyone has their own idea, including us. That's why I try to not go too deep into my beliefs and just stay open-minded, all that. Before we go, I want to get back to the thiamine stuff, and especially the processed grains and refined flour and sugar, how that depletes thiamine a lot. And I mean, not people listening, but most people out there are basing their diets on that stuff. So they're definitely probably depleted in thiamine. But I just want to know a little bit more about how that works, and it makes sense. And also about pro-metabolic diets. You mentioned Ray Peat, so we kind of just glossed over that. You mentioned bioenergetic. Like, there's different names of these kind of philosophies that people get into, and I've had guests on lately to
It's
talk
all.
about this, Kate Daring, and a lot of people actually over the last year. And it's like the Ray Peat, it's kind of what Saladino does. People, it's funny actually, the carnivore community, they're like, Paul Saladino, like he like betrayed us. Like, oh, he just got into the Ray Peat stuff and didn't ever talk about who thought of
I think
this
it's
stuff,
possible.
which was Ray. Yeah, I mean Ray Peat, but Ray Peat's great. Most of his, I think 95% of his stuff is awesome, and he gets into why the low, why linoleic acid and PUFAs in general are bad. He's into nose to tail eating. He actually just passed away, sadly. We might
Yeah.
have some sort of. There's some people around Austin that want to have an event, maybe at my Sapien Center in January for him. But basically, what I'm saying is he, he's into this idea of eating more carbohydrates from whole food
Mm.
sources, from fruit, honey, stuff like that. And I think him and people who fall, use his work. I don't know what it's called, the disciples. Um, they talk about that you are going to deplete minerals and thiamine and certain vitamins and minerals by eating more carbohydrates, but it's fine because you're eating liver and raw milk and good, like very nutrient dense diet. So maybe you can talk about that more, and the difference between refined and whole food
Yeah,
sources.
okay. So I just want to kind of preface this with, when I say bioenergetic, I'm aware that they referred to their diet or their dietary approach as bioenergetic. When I say bioenergetic, what I simply mean is how cells are generating energy. So I think the reason, or really a lot of the primary philosophy behind Ray Peat and his predecessors, was that it was essentially viewing cell health as generative energy. So as long as mitochondria can generate enough ATP, and cells can respond to the energetic demands placed upon them, then generally, so the organism is going to retain some degree of health and adaptation to the environment. So I wouldn't say that I fall under the category of following a repeat diet. I don't, although I
Mm-hmm.
think that a lot of it,
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of it's probably context dependent. But in terms of, so specifically on thiamine, I mean, if you look at the work of repeat, he's done a lot of, he's written a lot about using different B vitamins in therapeutic levels. So they focus primarily on, or a lot of his work focuses on the role of niacinamide, but he's also written about thiamine and things in the past, many years ago. Um, I think when it comes to eating a diet which is, or basically, most of the time when you eat food, like natural food, whole food, then that the amount of the nutrients needed to process that food internally are generally going to be there. So for instance, what you find
Yeah.
is that foods which naturally contain quite a lot of starch also tend to be quite high in thiamine, which is needed to process glucose. Doesn't necessarily apply to fruit, but what I would say is that the amount that you need to retain like health is really quite low. It's a milligram per day, or 1.5
Mm-hmm.
milligram. 1.5 milligrams per day, and that's not difficult. So even if you are eating uh, typically high carbohydrate whole foods, you're gonna usually be getting that amount. The problem only starts when you start eating, for instance, white rice that's not been fortified. When you start eating things like Haribo, which I think Ray Pete used to talk about, or some of the people on that forum, the Ray Pete forum, and in that community, they start eating like refined white sugar. Like, I fundamentally disagree with that. I don't think that's a good way to go. I think that if the amount of carbohydrate that you consume is basically, it's going to be roughly proportionate to the amount of B1 that you need. So if you're getting that from whole food sources, they're not going to tend to have that depleting effect on the body. Now, that's not to say that other things that you might be doing, for instance, drinking copious amounts of coffee, well, that can have a depleting effect. But if you're getting whole foods without the thiamine depleting factors like coffee or tea or polyphenols or anything, then basically you're going to be fairly good. If you don't have an underlying deficiency or that problem that we spoke about, like the organ specific deficiency, that's not really a problem. However, when you're consuming refined sugar, when you're consuming refined white rice, when you're consuming foods that have undergone the process to take out the anti-nutrients, which many of them are, oftentimes you usually also take out the B vitamins. And so because of that, like, I would say that if you're going to eat those foods, you want to be taking at least some kind of a B vitamin supplement.
Yeah, that's interesting. And also, Stan Efferding, who's a completely different bodybuilder type guy, he recommends cooking white rice and bone broth, which is what a lot of people I know in the Ray Peat community do. So you're kind of adding in the nutrients that you take out, so it actually turns into a decently nutritious food without the anti-nutrients of the husk of the rice.
Yeah, I mean, anything that you could do to, I mean, bone broth, I'm going to say it's not that high in B1, but I don't think there's an exact science for this in terms of you have to get this amount to, like, you have to have this amount of thiamine to be able to process this amount of carbs. It doesn't work like that. Like, the body has ways of recycling nutrients and things. It's just like, for instance, you could probably get by on eating white rice, a certain amount of it, 100 grams, 200 grams, and it might not have any like systemically depleting effects on your B1 status. That said, over long periods of time, if you're not eating other foods which are kind of disproportionately high in B1, then that could be a potential risk factor. In fact, I see many people who have been on bodybuilding diets, or have been on diets like in the gut community, you often see like elimination diets, basically people down to like 3 foods, and they can only tolerate like white rice and maybe one piece of meat. Those people are usually candidates for a B1 deficiency because they induce it over long periods of time. So
sounds like Japan too. I was going to go back to Japan. It's like if they're just eating the white rice and they don't, I mean, a lot of times throughout history, people didn't have enough food. They didn't have enough animal foods. They couldn't afford a varied diet like we can today.
Precisely.
And so, yeah.
No, exactly. I don't think there's any exact way by which you would measure, like, you see, the thing is, RDAs are estimates as well. It's basically the minimum amount that you need to prevent a full-blown deficiency disease. Now, it doesn't factor in what's coming from the gut. It doesn't factor in like what other things place demand on someone. Like, if someone does a lot of exercise, well, that's going to increase their requirement for nutrients across the board. If someone has an infection, that does the same thing. If someone has chronic inflammation, that does the same thing. So the RDA is probably not sufficient to meet all of those demands, like, for people in those different contexts. Personally, like, if you're asking my what I would advise to all the people I work with who come to me for health advice and what I do myself, like, I advise taking a multi B vitamin supplement, right? And the simple reason is because there are no known downsides from what I can see. If you get something which suits you personally, so whether that's methylated or non-methylated, there are environmental factors which actively steal those B vitamins from us and actively increase our requirement, which we have zero control over. Things we're exposed to, things that we do, things that we can't even necessarily see, can raise the requirement for those things. And our food supply, there are good arguments to be said that if, for instance, you're consuming vegetables which have been grown in certain types of soil, well, that's not necessarily going to be the same. If you get it from a supermarket, perhaps a lot of those the B vitamins and things have been damaged, have degraded. So I think one of the safe bets, or something that I recommend people do just to try and hit all of their basic requirements, is take a B complex. And if someone's following a repeat diet, I mean, they usually do that anyway. But I would definitely say if they're going to be consuming like high amounts of white sugar and things and ice cream and stuff, like you want to be taking, at least like 50 to 100 milligrams of thiamine every day, just to be safe. I mean, like, it doesn't hurt, like we have these tools at our disposal. There's no reason not to do it. Like, in my opinion, I can understand if someone doesn't want to do it, that's fair enough. They might not need to, but if they're actively consuming refined carbohydrates and actively consuming sugar in its refined form, like, I think you'd be silly not to.
Yeah. Well, real quick. So why I asked this kind of as part of my question, like why did the refined sugar, refined carbs deplete more? Is it an easy explanation?
Okay, yeah. Basically, thiamine, you need B1 to metabolize glucose, okay? If you consume a whole food which contains starch, glucose, usually it's going to contain thiamine in it as well, okay? So whilst you get an increased amount of glucose coming in, you also get an increased amount of B1 to help you metabolize that glucose. Now, the body can store B1 for about 27 days as well. So we do have storage, although it's limited. If you consume refined or empty, they call it empty calories, because it's pure glucose. Well, sucrose is not pure glucose, but what you're going to be using for energy is pure glucose. So you see, there's like an imbalance. It's like your B1 levels, and you eat a whole food, you're getting more glucose, but you're also topping up your B1. Whereas if you have your B1 here, you consume refined carbohydrates, you increase the demand by increasing glucose, but you don't get the increased levels of thiamine to match that demand. And so over time, if you continue doing that, then your stores, you're tapping into your stores and you're eventually depleting what's there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this happens with a lot of things beyond thiamine too. And people who have deficient diets, they don't really understand it. And that's kind of what I mentioned too. This nutrition stuff, it's like a puzzle, and there's so many things that can go wrong. And again, that's why nutrition stuff is interesting to me, because, well, not interesting. It's like complicated and frustrating because people don't realize what's going on. And then 5 years later, they just have all these problems. And I think that's what I try to do on Instagram or just with the film. What's going to be in the film is that I told you so doesn't mean anything. When it's too late, it's too late. So you just got to get into this stuff ahead of time. And man, it's just so much better. And everyone around me does this stuff and has seen so many improvements with the oxalate stuff. Yeah, I pretty much everyone I know seems to be on a low oxalate diet. Just I guess they've just all figured out the same thing.
That's awesome.
But before we go, so do you have certain things for one, people can work with you still? Or did you say you're out of the game, or you still do private
I'm out of the
clients?
game at the moment. I'm not doing any private clients. I'm focusing on some other stuff. I'm still kind of in the game, but I'm just not seeing patients. It got too busy.
Okay.
I had super long waiting list, so I see a couple of people here and there, but I've slowed that down. I'm actually I'm focusing on producing more content. I've got a couple of different projects going on, and I'm also in the process of writing a book. So that's taking a little bit longer than expected. Maybe I will get into consultations in the future again, but no, I'm trying to write a book on thiamine to distill the information into one place and to try to make it as understandable as possible. And we'll see where I go from there.
Well, that's great. Well, people can support you by buying that book. Maybe do you have like a website or like social media? How can people find you?
Yeah, I am on. I don't really use Instagram. I do have an account. It's EO Nutrition. So Elliot Overton, EO Nutrition. I have Twitter. I am mostly on YouTube or on Facebook. I also have a Facebook group. It's called Addressing Thiamine Deficiency and Paradoxical Reactions. In that is we have members who are basically come across information on thiamine responsive conditions and using high doses or mega doses. They want to know how to do it. There's not a lot of information on exactly how to do that, so that's what we discuss in the group. What forms to use, what supplements, what doses, how fast to do that, and what the symptoms are, and how to kind of manage the paradoxical reactions. So yeah, that's where people can find me, and on YouTube, EO Nutrition, and I generally most of my videos are about oxalate and thiamine, but I also know a little bit about other stuff, so I'm also making some videos on other stuff occasionally as well. Yeah.
Great stuff. So is a Facebook group the best place to find out about this high dose, or do you have a certain brand that you recommend? Or
Yeah. In terms of in terms of finding information on high dose, probably the Facebook group. There's a couple of Facebook groups online which are specifically kind of aimed at high doses of B1. But finding specifics can be difficult. So yeah, I would recommend joining the group and asking some questions. And there's always lots of people to tell you how much they used and what forms they use. I mean, the disclaimer. Here's a disclaimer. I formulate, so I manufacture my own supplements. I own a company or co-own a company called Objective Nutrients, and this is a manufacturer of different types of B1. Again, a point of contention. People will kind of say that, well, of course, I try to promote the benefits of B1, given that I own shares in the company who sells it. The ironic thing is that, you know, I was using this nutrient way before I ever planned on making a company. So there's lots of different types that people can use in terms of what forms they want to use. Generally, it's going to be thiamine hydrochloride, benfotiamine, sulbutamine, or thiamine tetrahydroferryl disulfide. I have some videos online of exactly which form does what. I also have an ebook in terms of how to know which form to use for which different condition. In terms of brands, really, if someone wanted to go ahead and try it, they could use any brand. It doesn't really matter. They could use any form. But for people who want to know about the nuances, some forms work better for different conditions. So there's just type in EO Nutrition online and you can see the articles I've written. I've also written for a website called Hormones Matter, which is run by Chandler Mars and Derek Lonsdale, who was a thiamine researcher. He's contributed a lot on that website, and there's a lot of really useful information online with regards to how much to use and when to use it in different conditions and things like that. So yeah.
Well, great stuff. Yeah, I don't blame you for getting into that, the thiamine supplement world, because you believe in it. It's kind of like what I did with meat,
Right.
and I sell, regenerative grass-fed, grass-finished meat raised here in Texas. And that was years after I started doing my content, because I'm like, what else would I want to do?
Right.
You mean, should I start a company selling Pop-Tarts? Like, of course not. I'm going to start a company that has the best meat available.
Yeah.
So yeah, nose to tail, if you don't know it already.
No,
And
I
check
do.
out. Yeah.
It's excellent what you do. I had a look. You got the stuff that you offer is awesome. The fact that you can make a company and actually offer that to people, that's great. You get to decide exactly what's in it, where it's sourced from. You know, all the control is in your hands. It's awesome. Exactly.
And I'm sure vegans will come after me. And I'm sure when my film comes out, there's going to be articles debunking me about I'm benefiting from the meat world. I'm like, hey, I don't make any money. This selling meat is not a moneymaker. I'll tell you that. The processed products are where it's at. And I don't really sell processed products. I have beef tallow skincare, which could be considered a processed product, but really it's just beef tallow and essential oils. And it's really hard to make. So anyway, great stuff. Thank you so much. Yeah, go to YouTube is probably the best place to start, because you just have a lot of good videos.
Yeah.
And thanks so much for coming on.
It was really a pleasure. Thank you for having me on. Great speaking with you, Brian.
All right. I'll see ya.